Well, joining me now for more on this is former White House Chief of Staff and now Bondi Partners consultant Mick Mulvaney. Good morning to you, Mick. Lovely to have your company. The Kremlin denies the conversation. Not a great look, a bit confusing. What's going on?
Holly, it's hard to know, but I mean, if I'm sitting here and Donald Trump tells me he had the phone call and Vladimir Putin says he didn't have the phone call, I'm going to believe Donald Trump as between those two folks, especially with Putin's recent history about not being honest about when he's talking to Donald Trump or what he's congratulating him on. But that's fine. Look, we're splitting hairs. What difference does it make if they talk today? The real question is, what policy changes will Trump put in place once he's sworn in January?
Yeah, I mean, it leaves many questions as to why Putin would deny it or why the Kremlin would deny it. But I guess you're right. It matters what's going to happen in the future. I mean, Trump has promised to end the war in Ukraine. How exactly will he plan on doing that, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think anybody really takes him at his word that he'll end it in 24 hours. I think a lot of us who know how Donald Trump speaks knows that's hyperbole, it's exaggeration, but he's going to have very little patience. Look, I've traveled a great deal in Europe over the course of the last several years. Everybody I've talked to on the left and the right seems to acknowledge, at least privately, the same thing, which is that war in Ukraine ends with Ukraine ceding some territory, the Crimea and maybe something else, in exchange for more Western guarantees for Ukrainian sovereignty. Period. End of story. Russia doesn't take over all of Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't get all of Ukraine back, including Crimea. There's some type of cessation of hostilities based upon that model I just laid out. The question is it going to be sooner rather than later? And I think with Donald Trump, it's going to be sooner.
OK, well, I mean, Donald Trump's team is shaping up pretty quickly. He's not wasting any time. What do you make of his key appointments?
A couple different things. The chief of staff position went first. I thought that was interesting because that would be a position that would help build the White House. And then he named two immigration people, Tom Homan as the border czar, which is an overused term. It essentially means it's not an official position. And then Stephen Miller, who worked with me in the White House in the first Trump administration as a deputy chief of staff, my guess is with a focus on immigration, because he's been central in formulating Trump policy since 2016 on immigration. The message there is that Trump will be spending a great deal of time and energy, as will his administration, on the immigration issue in the first 6 months of his presidency. Be curious to see when the other names start to come out. He named a UN ambassador today. He named an EPA administrator. Those are a little bit unusual, Holly, because they are considered to be secondary sort of cabinet positions. Not to diminish them in any way, but it's not the same as the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. So be curious to see over the course of the next couple of days who's in.
Yeah, I mean, Trump has appointed, as you just mentioned, Lee Zeldin to lead the environmental agency. What do we know about him?
Lee's a friend of mine, was a member of Congress from upstate New York. Excuse me, from Long Island, I think he was from. And he ran for governor a couple years back and was unsuccessful, but did much better than people realize. So he's a Trump Republican from a blue state. He and the president have gone along very well. I worked with Lee a good bit when I was the chief of staff. He is highly regarded in Republican circles as sort of a centrist Republican, sort of a moderate Republican, not in a bad sort of way to Republican minds, but sort of somebody that a lot of folks can work with. So I thought it was a good pick. Elise Stefanik over at the UN ambassador's position, also another good pick, another Republican from New York. So Trump seems to be going home with some of his early picks to his home state.
What will this mean? Will it mean pulling back on previous funding for clean energy? We know Trump has called the climate crisis a hoax.
Yeah, the money is going to dry up. There's no question, to the extent it can. Keep in mind, Holly, things that have been passed into law here, as much of the green energy did as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, that's really hard to undo. Things that have been done in regulation that haven't risen to the level of legislation are easier to undo. So I expect all of the Trump administration to look at rolling back regulations that were put in place by Biden's administration, but Zeldin especially. I don't think he'll be able to undo the legislation, which underpins a lot of our green energy and climate change initiatives here, but he will be able to hem it in using the regulatory authority at the Environmental Protection Agency.
Yes, we know he's been a critic when it comes to climate change. I just want to talk to you, Mick, about appointing hardliner Tom Homan to oversee those mass deportations. I mean, Homan was a pretty controversial figure in Trump's first term because he oversaw the zero tolerance, I guess you could say, policy that separated many families while enforcing those immigration laws. I mean, this mass deportation is a really big task. Is he the right person for the job in your view?
Oh, I think so. I don't have the same impression that a lot of other folks are worried about of this group of, jackbooted troops going door to door saying papers, please. But I think by the appointment of Tom Homan, what you've seen is now an absolute commitment to at least part of this deportation plan. I think they said they were going to focus on, there's about 1 million people in this country, Holly, who have already been through our court system. They came seeking asylum. They went to court. They were denied asylum status and told they had to leave. But under the previous administration, they were allowed to essentially self-deport and just stayed in the country. So my guess is that Mr. Homan will start with those over 1 million people who have already been through the legal process, and that's where he'll start his deportation process.
Okay, it'll be interesting to see how he goes about it. And also, of course, he got rid of Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo, wanting a fresh start, it might seem. But we do have to wrap things up, Mick. It's also Veterans Day in America today, and we saw Biden appear with Harris.
Yeah, listen, it's his last Veterans Day today. Look, he's clearly, this is his last days anyway. This is his lame duck period. I wish him the very best. I'm glad he got a chance to address the troops under our system, Holly. He is the commander in chief, so the absolute head of our armed forces and so forth. So it's a nice event for him to go to. I think you're not going to see very much of Joe Biden now in the next couple of days, and certainly won't see much of him after he leaves. But it's nice to see him go out. Of course, he's got lunch with President Trump tomorrow. Maybe that'll be the last sort of highlight of his term.
That'll be interesting. Mick Mulvaney, lovely to see you as always. Catch up soon.